You were never supposed to hear this. And if you stay, something inside you will not return the same, because the story I'm about to tell you was buried, not by mistake, not by accident, but by deliberate hands, men and institutions who understood that what happened in Argentina in the 1890s was not just an anomaly of medicine, but a fracture in the nature of time itself, a secret that bends the spine of reality until it breaks. Picture this: Córdoba province, 1890. A birth recorded but blurred with water, as if someone tried to erase not words, but truth itself. A midwife listed who hadn't been licensed in years. A child entered into the registry with 2 sets of measurements, and no explanation. And then, decades later, a photograph sealed behind plaster in an orphanage wall. 2 boys side by side, wearing the same suit, sitting in the same posture, but separated by decades in appearance. One young, fragile, barely 12. The other, balding, wrinkled, sunken with the gravity of age. They were twins, born together, raised together, but never aging together. One decayed too quickly, as if time poured through him like sand through shattered glass. The other lingered in childhood, a body refusing to obey the clock, trapped in a youth that never gave way to growth. The records called it clerical error. The church called it spiritual confusion. The physicians whispered of anatomical irregularities, but none of them dared to ask the question that was bleeding just beneath the surface. What if time itself is not constant? What if, in rare and forbidden circumstances, 2 lives can anchor themselves to different currents of reality, one dragged forward, one forced to remain behind? You see, history is not the clean, linear story they spoon-feed you in textbooks. It is jagged, corrupted, and punctured by fractures so disturbing that governments, churches, and archives conspire to seal them away. The twins of Córdoba were not just children. They were evidence, living proof that the human body can be enslaved by laws far older than science, or liberated from them. And here is the part you must understand. This was not an isolated case. Men have spent centuries probing this secret. Emperors, priests, secret lodges, men in robes, men in uniforms, men in laboratories. They all reached for the same forbidden truth. Time is not a river, it is a cage, and the cage can be broken. But you, right now, listening in the comfort of your own room, must feel the weight of what you've just stepped into. Because once I reveal what these twins became, how one aged as if burning from the inside out, while the other clung to youth with inhuman stillness, you will not see your own reflection the same again. Tell me, do you think your life is truly moving forward? Or is it possible that something, or someone, is siphoning years from you, while another keeps them? This is the descent we're about to take, down into the hidden logs of physicians who refuse to publish, into the parish archives where priests scrawled warnings in the margins and sealed photographs in crypt drawers, into the unsent letters of a governess who heard the boy speak in languages dead for centuries, and you will see how institutions, the church, the state, the medical guilds, closed their ranks to protect not the children, but the secret. The twins of Córdoba were not a story of anomaly. They were a message, a warning, a glimpse into the machinery of reality that most men live and die never seeing. And once you see it, you will never again mistake your body for your own. Because time, your time, is not your possession. It is rented, leased, managed by powers you cannot name. And tonight I will show you the moment the mask slipped, the night lightning shattered the hospital windows, and 2 infants came into this world, bound by blood, but condemned to different clocks. So breathe slowly. Let the room grow darker around you. This is not entertainment. This is an initiation, and once you step through, you will not be the same man who pressed play. The first thing you must understand is this: corruption never starts with fire. It begins with ink, with the small, deliberate errors on paper that later bloom into silence. In June of 1883, the hospital of San Bartolomé, Córdoba province, recorded a birth. The mother's name was Isidora G. The physician's handwriting was unsteady, too hurried for a man who had been practicing for decades. The registry states, male infant, delivered at 11:47 p.m. Nothing unusual, nothing complicated, and yet, in the margins, something trembles. 2 sets of measurements, the same child, the same name, the same time of birth, but 2 different bodies. One weight, one length, then another, smaller, barely noted, no explanation, and in the corner a midwife's signature. Only it wasn't hers. She had not been licensed for 3 years. She shouldn't even have been there. You see how it works? Truth is not erased with fire. It's erased with water. The bottom of that page is blurred, as if someone tried to wash away the contradiction instead of crossing it out. Like they didn't want us to see what was written, but they also didn't want us to forget that something was written. The official record says 1 boy was born, but the whispers that circulated in that storm-battered hospital that night told another story. The attending physician, Dr. Ernesto Gilabert, a man who spent most of his career baptizing infants and signing off on farm injuries, wrote a memo 3 days later in his private journal, just a single line. This is not duplication. They are not copies. What did he mean? What did he see that made him draw that distinction? Because if you've ever studied anomalies, the forbidden cases, the ones buried in private archives, you'll know one thing. The human mind cannot accept contradiction without inventing language to contain it. And his language is clear. These were not copies. Not one boy mirrored in another. Something else. The midwife never returned. She told her niece that one of the children never blinked during the first hour, and that both had dried blood beneath their fingernails, though neither had been cut. She claimed the room grew cold. Not the natural cold of storm winds, but an inversion, a reversal, as if heat had been pulled out of the air itself. The mother, unconscious until the following evening, was told she had 1 son. She never knew she had delivered 2. And yet, 10 days later, the baptismal record from the parish priest tells a different tale. 2 names, Santiago Ignacio, Mateo Alonso, both written under 1 registration number, as if forced to share a single space in the Book of Souls. A pencil mark in the margin, correction pendiente, pending correction. No correction was ever made. Do you see how quickly the machinery of denial moves? A child is born into contradiction. The papers bend, the church pretends, the doctors write in half-truths, and by the end of a single month the story has already been buried. But burial leaves cracks. A nurse, interviewed years later, insisted that 2 bassinets had been prepared, that for the first 3 weeks the children lay side by side, and that the second child barely moved, tracking the world around him with eyes that did not look like an infant's. And then one day, he was gone. No announcement, no explanation, only 1 boy remained to be cradled in photographs and paraded before the neighbors. Now, think carefully. If this had been nothing but rumor, the state would have dismissed it, but instead, by late July, the hospital was audited for clerical inconsistencies. And which records were lost? Only those from June 13th to June 16th, the precise window of the twins' birth. Convenience or quiet redaction? And then, the silence deepened. Dr. Gilabert, the physician who had written the words, "not copies," was dead by September. Cerebral hemorrhage, they said. He left no testimony beyond that single memo. No elaboration, no report. Just a line carved into private paper, drowned with him before the year turned cold. But the traces refused to vanish. Parish staff remembered, servants whispered, and a single photograph survived, hidden in a drawer in the diocesan archive, unpublished, uncatalogued, sealed under the label unverified artifact. 2 boys in identical suits, same posture, same expression, but one aged, the other preserved. And here, my friend, is where we must stop pretending this is just a medical curiosity. Because in every instance where the institutions tried to erase them, in every blurred record, every lost certificate, every buried photograph, one fact screams through. These boys were proof that time is not equal, that it can accelerate in one vessel and stagnate in another, proof that reality itself can fracture, and that the fracture does not destroy you, it simply bends you into something unrecognizable. The church could not allow that. The state could not allow that. Medicine could not allow that. Because if such proof was made public, the world's foundations would collapse overnight. The lie of equality in time, the lie of universal law would wither. And men, ordinary men like you, would realize the most dangerous truth of all. That time is not your master, it is your captor. But when cracks appear in the walls of a prison, what do the jailers do? They patch them quickly. They silence the inmates who see the light breaking through. That's what happened in Cordoba. The twins were not protected, they were contained, hidden, suppressed. And yet, despite every attempt to erase them, their story survived. In ink that bled with water, in photographs hidden behind plaster, in journals written in fear. Survived enough for us now, more than a century later, to reach through the cracks and touch the forbidden. I tell you this because it matters to you, right now, not as history, but as revelation. Because if the twins could exist, if one child could be pulled into old age while the other refused to leave infancy, then what is happening to you every time you look in the mirror and feel older than you should? What if time is already uneven, distributed, manipulated, siphoned? What if some part of you is being drained, accelerated, aged by forces you cannot see? The twins were not an error, they were evidence. And this is only the beginning of their story. At first, the family tried to pretend. Children change quickly, they told themselves. Babies put on weight differently, they said. Some grow slowly, some fast. It was easy for a few months to explain away the unsettling imbalance. Santiago was simply the weaker child, the one who had to be carried more, nursed more. Mateo, healthy and alert, became the pride of the house. But as the years bent forward, the lie became impossible to maintain. Because while Mateo stayed, Santiago accelerated. By the time they were 5, the contradiction had already rooted itself into every room of the home. Mateo still had the face of a child, soft skin, eyes that carried the unformed innocence of youth. His voice was high, his frame small, his teeth like a boy barely out of toddlerhood. But Santiago had begun to wrinkle. His face had thinned, lines etching into the corners of his mouth. His hair, once dark and soft, showed threads of grey. By 7 years old, he looked like a man in his 20s. Neighbors began to murmur, at first in pity. The poor boy cursed with some wasting disease. But when they saw Mateo, the brother who had not changed at all, who still played with dolls and rocked on the swings with the same childish joy, pity hardened into fear. "What sorcery is this?" they whispered. "What sin has touched this family?" And the whispers reached the church. Father Alvarez, the parish priest, recorded a note in his ledger in 1898. Santiago's voice is too heavy for a child. He confesses with knowledge beyond his years. He trembles as an old man, yet sits beside his brother as if they were not born together. Mateo remains unchanging, a lamb caught in perpetual infancy. Think about that. A priest trained to recognize sin and anomaly, faced with 2 brothers born of the same womb, now representing opposite ends of life. One advancing like a clock wound too tight, the other trapped as if time itself refused to turn. What does a church do when confronted with evidence that contradicts the very laws it claims are divinely ordained? It buries it, but first it observes. For the next decade, quiet inquiries were made, physicians summoned under pretext, notes scribbled on scraps and locked away in diocesan drawers. And in those notes, a horrifying truth began to emerge. By 10 years old, Santiago's body had collapsed into the form of a middle-aged man. His skin sagged, his teeth loosened, his spine arched with the brittle stiffness of age. He groaned when he walked. He lost hair by the handful. By 12, he looked older than his own father. And Mateo? Still a boy, still soft-faced, round-eyed, uncorrupted by time. His voice never deepened, his bones never lengthened, his body clung to a stasis that mocked biology. The 2 brothers, born of the same blood, raised in the same household, had become a living contradiction. One racing forward, one trapped behind. Eyewitnesses recorded it in hushed tones. A governess hired briefly to assist the family wrote in a letter never meant for public eyes. They sit together in the evenings, but the room cannot contain the horror of it. Santiago speaks with the tired bitterness of an old man, yet Mateo asks him to play with toys as if they are still both children. When they argue, it is unbearable. A child's cry against an old man's voice, coming from 2 bodies born of the same mother. It is a blasphemy against the order of creation. And the governess Added something darker. She claimed that at night, when the house was still, she heard Mateo speaking words she could not understand, a language with rhythms unlike Spanish, unlike Latin. Harsh syllables yet spoken with perfect fluency, as if he remembered rather than learned. She swore she once entered the room and found Santiago weeping, his wrinkled hands clutched together, begging Mateo to stop. Now pause. Think. What could a child who never aged, possibly be saying to his brother that would make an old man collapse into sobs? The church did not ask. It ordered silence. The governess was dismissed. The letter was hidden. But the family lived with the reality that their home was no longer private. Eyes watched from shadows. Clerics visited without explanation. Every year the twins were measured, recorded, studied, and every year the records contradicted the laws of life itself. By 1902, Santiago's body had failed. His bones thinned, his muscles wasted. At 15, he walked with a cane. At 16, he could barely see. At 17, his skin had the yellow pallor of liver collapse. He died before his 18th birthday, his body resembling that of an 80-year-old man. The funeral was small, unremarkable. Officially, he had succumbed to degenerative illness. The papers carried no mention of anomaly. But what of Mateo? Here is where the horror sharpens. Because when the coffin was lowered, when Santiago's body rotted in the earth, Mateo stood beside the grave. Still a boy. Still the same height, the same soft features, the same innocent face. Not 17, not 18, not even 12. He was frozen, a fragment of youth detached from the rest of reality. The people who attended that burial whispered in fear. Some swore they would not return to that parish again. Mothers clutched their children close as if Mateo's presence might contaminate them. The priest, pale and trembling, rushed through the final rites, but Mateo remained. Imagine it. A family burying one son aged beyond his years, while the other stands untouched, defying the grave's reminder. Imagine the eyes of the villagers staring at the child who should have grown, who should have grieved with the weary body of a young man, but who stood unchanged, his hair the same, his skin unlined, his voice still childlike. The church called it mystery. The physicians called it error. The neighbors called it curse. But you, hearing this now, must call it what it is. Evidence. Evidence that time can be broken, that it can drain through one vessel like acid, while refusing to touch another. Mateo did not die. He lingered. Lingering became the true horror, because as decades passed he remained. The boy who did not grow. The boy who stood in photographs beside new generations. Always the same face, always the same height, always the same unblinking gaze. The twin who lived was not a blessing. He was the living wound, proof that time's cage had cracked and that something unspeakable had crawled through. And his survival was only the beginning of the nightmare. The grave closed over Santiago, but nothing could close over Mateo. When the mourners left, when the priest's words faded into memory, when the coffin rotted beneath soil, Mateo lingered. He walked home with his family that day, still clutching the small wooden toy horse he had played with since childhood, as though no years had passed. His father staggered with grief, his mother's eyes were hollow with loss. But Mateo smiled, a child's smile, soft and oblivious, as though death itself had not just stolen his brother. And yet those who saw him did not see innocence. They saw something else, something uncanny, a child without time. Whispers spread across Cordoba faster than disease. They called him El Niño Eterno, the eternal child, not in reverence, not in celebration, but in dread. Farmers spat on the ground when his name was mentioned. Women tugged their children away when he passed on the street. Old men muttered prayers under their breath, convinced he was an omen, a mark that the devil had walked into their parish. But where ordinary villagers recoiled in fear, others, men with darker curiosities, leaned closer. The first were the doctors, not country physicians, not parish healers, but scholars from Buenos Aires, carrying polished instruments and cold eyes. They arrived under the guise of charity, claiming they had heard of the family's tragedy and wanted to help. But their help meant measurement, examination, prodding, endless questions. One report, later smuggled from a medical library and hidden in a private collection, recorded Mateo's body as a biological impossibility. His bones showed no signs of growth beyond infancy. His teeth remained fixed in juvenile development. His skin, when pricked, healed faster than expected, as though renewal had been accelerated in some areas, slowed to stillness in others. But the most disturbing note came from Dr. Ernesto Palacios, a man who kept his findings locked in a journal never published. He wrote, "The boy's pulse is irregular, yet constant, like the ticking of a clock that neither loses nor gains time. His blood coagulates at a rate I cannot reconcile with biology. When I touch his wrist, it is as though I am feeling the pulse of something older than him, older than me, older than our species. It is rhythm without beginning, rhythm without end." Palacios tried to keep his obsession quiet, but secrets like this never remain hidden for long. Soon the church began circling again. A visiting bishop from the capital ordered private confession sessions with Mateo. No one was permitted inside, but servants whispered that the boy emerged pale, trembling, speaking in tongues again, words that sounded more ancient than Latin. And the bishop? His notes have never surfaced. Only a single line survives, scribbled in the margin of an unrelated homily, as if he feared committing more to paper. The child is not trapped in time. The child is outside it. By 1905, whispers of Mateo had reached beyond Argentina. Letters coded in careful script began moving across borders. Letters to Europe, to societies who studied not just medicine but metaphysics, alchemy, forbidden philosophies. And so the outsiders came, not in daylight, not in public, but in secret. A German scholar named Werner Adler visited Cordoba under the pretense of studying South American folklore. In reality, he had ties to the Theosophical Society. He spent 3 nights in the family's home, recording observations. Later, Adler would write to his colleagues in Munich, "This boy is not human in the sense we define humanity. He is not evolving within time, but standing as a pillar while time flows around him. His very existence suggests that mortality is not law but error." Pause here, let that sink in. For centuries, death has been treated as inevitable, universal, yet here was a boy who suggested it might not be inevitable at all, that time could ignore a man, skip him, refuse to pull him forward. To some, this was blasphemy. To others, it was salvation, and salvation attracts zealots. By the turn of the century, the family was no longer just a household in grief. They were prisoners of attention. Men in black coats watched their windows, strangers followed them to markets, their letters were intercepted, their neighbors turned away, convinced the household was cursed. Mateo, still unchanged, seemed oblivious. He played, he sang, he spoke in strange tongues when he thought no one was listening. But to those who studied him, his playfulness was more terrifying than if he had screamed. Because how does one laugh? How does one smile after watching one's own twin grow old and rot while you remain untouched? Some began to wonder, was Mateo even human anymore? Or had he become a vessel for something else? Something that used his body as an anchor while it peered into our world? The family, crushed under pressure, tried to move him in secret. They left Cordoba for the countryside, but he was followed, always followed. A photograph survives. Blurred, grainy, snapped without permission. A group of men in long coats standing outside a farmhouse at night, their faces obscured, their bodies rigid, watching. And at the edge of the photograph, almost hidden in shadow, a small boy at the window, staring out. Mateo, his face unchanged, his gaze unblinking. By 1910, the visits became constant. Not only scientists, not only priests, but others. Men who carried strange symbols carved into rings, who spoke in riddles, who asked to see the boy not as a patient but as a prophet. And here lies the true fracture in history. These men were not dismissed as charlatans. They were welcomed into private salons, funded by wealthy patrons, backed by networks of secrecy. Because if Mateo was proof that time could be bent, then whoever controlled him controlled the most forbidden secret of all, immortality. The eternal child was no longer just a curiosity. He had become a key, and keys are never left alone. By 1912, Mateo was no longer simply the eternal child. He was no longer even just a boy. He had become an object, a specimen, a tool. The men who surrounded him, scientists with trembling hands, priests with trembling faith, secretive benefactors with trembling ambitions, all saw the same thing in him, not innocence, not tragedy, but power. You see, to them, Matteo was not just surviving outside of time. He was proof that time itself was not law, but a variable, and if something can be bent, it can be controlled, and if it can be controlled, it can be owned. The first documented experiment came in the winter of 1912, in a private convent outside Córdoba. The family had been convinced to bring Matteo there under the promise of protection, of sanctuary. In reality, it was a prison disguised as holy ground. Witness accounts describe a cold chamber, its walls painted with crosses and alchemical sigils side by side, the sacred and the forbidden scrawled together. The boy was placed in the center, surrounded by candles, while physicians took measurements. They pricked his skin, noted how quickly it healed. They tested his reflexes, his memory, his ability to recognize dates and seasons. But the most disturbing test was one no official record describes in detail, only hinted at in fragments. They tried to measure his presence against clocks. 3 clocks were placed in the room, 1 mechanical, 1 sand-filled, 1 water-based. And as the experiment unfolded, each began to behave differently. The sand clumped and slowed, refusing to fall at its normal pace. The water trickled irregularly, halting as though frozen, then rushing as though catching up. And the mechanical clock, its hands shook violently before shattering the glass and bending backward. The observers were horrified but also exhilarated. Matteo was not merely outside of time. His very existence seemed to warp its flow. Reports of this clock fracture leaked into private correspondence between European lodges. Within months, envoys from France, Germany, and even Britain arrived in Argentina under false names. They came not to see a boy, but to see what they called the fulcrum. And soon, the experiments grew darker. They began bringing objects into his presence: fruit, cloth, metals. Some rotted faster than expected. Others seemed preserved, refusing to decay. A single apple, left in Matteo's room for 3 years, was found untouched, its skin smooth, its flesh fresh as the day it was picked. Then came the animals. A series of rabbits, dogs, even a calf. Some were placed with Matteo for days, others only for minutes. The results were grotesque. Certain animals aged rapidly, their fur whitening, their spines bending in accelerated decline. Others froze in juvenile states, unable to grow, their bodies trapped in arrested development. And in rare, most disturbing cases, twins. One aged to death within weeks, the other remained newborn. The researchers called it siphoning. They believed Matteo was not suspended in time by accident, but by feeding from it, draining years from others, hoarding them, leaving behind shells of creatures who had unknowingly paid the price for his stasis. But if that was true, what had he been feeding on all along? The priests argued it was diabolical, an inversion of divine order. The scientists argued it was natural law, misunderstood but exploitable. The secret orders argued it was prophecy. The boy was not an accident, but a signal that humanity was ready to ascend beyond time. And through it all, Matteo smiled. He played. He laughed. He looked at men 40 years older than when he first met them and called them by name as if no time had passed. For him, perhaps, it hadn't, but the truth grew impossible to contain. Servants whispered. Papers hinted. Local villagers spoke of shadows around the convent at night. Matteo's existence became rumor, and rumor became threat. And so, in 1915, the convent burned. The official explanation was accident. A lantern overturned, wood too dry, flames too fast. But fragments of hidden archives suggest otherwise, that the fire was no accident at all, but a purge. Witnesses describe men in dark uniforms leaving the grounds before the fire was discovered. And when the flames died, the convent was ash. But Matteo was gone, but not lost. Within months, sightings of the boy surfaced again, not in Córdoba but in Buenos Aires, then in Montevideo, then whispered rumors as far as Spain. He appeared in photographs where he should not be. Group portraits where a child stood in the corner, face unchanged, though decades separated the dates. Always the same face, always the same age, and wherever he appeared, those who encountered him reported the same effects. Clocks malfunctioning, crops spoiling, bodies weakening without explanation. By the 1920s, Matteo was no longer a provincial legend. He had become an international obsession. Circles of scientists called him the anomaly. Orders of mystics called him the key. But a growing number of men called him something else. A weapon. Because if one boy could warp time around him, what could be done if his condition were replicated? Harnessed? Engineered? Could soldiers be frozen in youth? Could empires strip years from their enemies and hoard them for themselves? Could death itself be cornered, captured, and sold? This was no longer about a child. This was about dominion. Dominion over the final frontier, not land, not air, not sea, but time itself. And men will kill for dominion. The eternal child was no longer hidden. He was hunted. And the chase had only begun. When the convent burned in 1915, most believed Matteo had perished in the flames. It was safer that way. The church could quietly bury the embarrassment, the scientists could file their reports into locked drawers, and the family could finally grieve in peace. But fire does not erase what it cannot consume. Somewhere in the chaos, Matteo had been taken, smuggled, hidden, spirited away under the cloak of night. To this day, no one agrees on who orchestrated it. A sect within the church seeking to hide him, an underground society seeking to keep him, or perhaps foreign agents who had been watching all along. What is known is this. By the early 1920s, Matteo surfaces again, not in Argentina, but in Europe. A blurred photograph dated 1922 shows a gathering of men in suits outside a villa near Marseille. Their faces are stern, their posture rigid. And there, nearly hidden, almost mistaken for a servant's child, stands a boy of perhaps 10 years old, the same dark hair, the same hollow smile, Matteo. And here is where the story curdles into something far more sinister. Because Europe in those years was boiling. Empires had collapsed after the Great War. Nations were rebuilding, hungry, fractured, desperate for power. And in desperation, the unthinkable becomes desirable. Among the many strange currents of the 1920s was the rise of occult politics. Men of influence, politicians, generals, financiers, began to flirt openly with mysticism, alchemy, hidden societies. They sought not just economic dominance, but metaphysical power, a way to rewrite the rules of the world itself. And Matteo was a perfect lure. From Marseille, he is next seen in Berlin. A report from 1924 describes a secret gathering of the Thule Society, an occult order that would later influence the ideological backbone of Nazism. The report, written by a skeptical Swiss observer, mentions a child presented as a living fracture in time whose body defies the decay of the years. The child did not speak during the gathering. He simply stood, smiling faintly. Clocks in the room once again faltered, one stopped entirely. It was here many believed that Matteo passed from curiosity to asset. By the late 1920s, rumors of the Eternal Boy appear in classified intelligence memos. British intelligence referred to him as Specimen M. French agents called him l'enfant figé, the frozen child, and German officials in their coded reports used a more chilling term, der Schlüssel, the key, because by now the experiments had resumed. Testimonies leaked decades later, from physicians who claimed they were forced to observe, from assistants who later broke silence. They described sessions held in underground chambers across Europe. Matteo would be placed at the center of a room. Around him, metals, plants, living animals, always the same results. Decay warped, time faltered. But the obsession deepened further. These new men were not content with measuring. They wanted to extract. How does one capture time itself? How does one bottle immortality? One physician, a Czech by the name of Victor Kroll, attempted the impossible. He claimed to have siphoned blood from Matteo and transfused it into dying patients. The patients revived, briefly, but their recovery came with disturbing side effects. Rapid hallucinations, voices in forgotten tongues, violent spasms. Within weeks, all of them were dead. Their bodies aged into skeletal husks overnight, as though centuries had been stolen in hours. Kroll fled, disgraced, but the seed had been planted. Matteo's blood was not mere biology. It was fuel. And fuel, no matter how unstable, always attracts those willing to gamble everything. By 1930, the boy was no longer being passed quietly between convents and salons. He was under state control. Germany in particular showed extraordinary interest. Officials began transporting him between secure facilities. Witnesses describe heavily armed convoys, secret tunnels, entire laboratories built for his containment. Matteo, still appearing no older than 10, was now a state secret. But here is the cruelest irony. In private accounts from guards and attendants, the boy remained unchanged in demeanor. He asked for toys, he played with marbles, he hummed nursery songs, he laughed at shadows on the wall. And when scientists pressed him with questions about God, about time, about eternity, he responded with the same childish smile, as though he could not understand what they sought. But then, at night, attendants claimed they heard him whisper, not in Spanish, not in German, but in that same unknown tongue from his childhood, a language no one recognized, one that bent the air when he spoke it, and those who listened too long reported losing hours. Entire chunks of memory vanished, as though time itself had slipped through their grasp. What was he saying? Was he speaking, or was time itself speaking through him? By the mid-1930s, the stakes had risen. A new power was clawing its way to dominance in Germany, one obsessed with rewriting destiny, one willing to plunder both science and the supernatural to build an empire that would last 1,000 years. To them, Matteo was not a boy. He was proof that time could be bent, stolen, controlled, and in the hands of men who sought eternal rule, what more dangerous thing could exist than the eternal child? By 1936, Germany had entered a fever. A nation rebuilt itself from humiliation, industry roared to life, and banners of crimson, black and white drowned the cities. But behind the military parades and speeches, a quieter current surged, the pursuit of the supernatural. The Nazi regime did not simply want soldiers, tanks or planes. It wanted destiny itself bent to its will. The SS under Heinrich Himmler became not just a paramilitary order, but an occult brotherhood. They scoured the world for relics, ancient texts, forgotten bloodlines, anything that promised access to power beyond the ordinary. And so when whispers of the boy who never aged reached their ears, it was inevitable. Matteo would become theirs. We do not know the exact moment he was taken. Some say he was transferred from French custody in a secret exchange. Others insist he was abducted outright, snatched during transport by German operatives. Whatever the truth, by the late 1930s, Matteo was firmly in Nazi hands, spirited away into the SS's most secret program, Ahnenerbe. The Ahnenerbe was officially an institute for ancestral heritage, but in reality it was a laboratory of nightmares. Archaeologists, physicians, mystics and engineers worked side by side, trying to fuse science and myth. To them, Matteo was the crown jewel. They called him Project Ewigkeit, Project Eternity. Inside the stone walls of Wewelsburg Castle, Himmler's occult headquarters, Matteo was kept in a chamber designed like both a prison and a temple. Accounts describe concentric rings painted on the floor, a mosaic of runes and walls lined with both medical instruments and ritual artifacts. The boy was tested relentlessly. His blood was drawn daily. Scientists claimed it contained markers not found in ordinary human plasma, proteins that resisted degradation, structures that seemed to regenerate even outside the body. Attempts were made to synthesize it, to inject it into prisoners. Results were catastrophic. Violent seizures, premature aging, madness. Still, the experiments continued. Prisoners from concentration camps were brought as test subjects. Twins in particular were of interest. One would be placed in prolonged proximity to Matteo, the other isolated. In some cases, the twin near him remained unchanged, while the other aged unnaturally fast. In other cases, both suffered. One withered, one remained frozen in development. It was not science. It was butchery dressed as research. But the most chilling project was not in blood, but in time itself. Deep beneath Wewelsburg, engineers constructed chambers designed to magnify Matteo's field. Massive pendulums, magnetic coils, and mirrored walls were installed. The goal was not simply to study him, but to weaponize his anomaly. Imagine for a moment a battlefield where enemy troops suddenly aged decades in minutes, where engines rusted in hours, where food supplies rotted overnight. Imagine the power of a weapon that could steal time itself from an entire army. That was the dream. Witnesses, guards who later defected, villagers forced into labor, told stories of experiments gone wrong. Soldiers brought into proximity with Matteo collapsed into skeletal husks. Others screamed as their hair whitened, their teeth fell out, their skin shriveled. And yet, sometimes the opposite occurred. Young recruits who stood guard near him remained youthful long after their peers had aged. The SS believed they had found not only a weapon but a path to immortality. Himmler himself reportedly visited the boy in 1941. In a private diary fragment, a line is written, "The key is not a child, he is a door, and when we learn to open him fully, the Reich will never fall." But there was a problem. Matteo could not be controlled. He did not follow commands. He did not respond to threats. He remained, as he had always been, a child. A boy with a strange smile, humming songs, speaking that incomprehensible tongue when no one listened. The men who tried to exploit him were, in the end, playing with something they could neither understand nor contain. The war turned. 1943, 1944. Defeat crept closer. Allied bombs shattered German cities, armies pushed from east and west. And still Matteo remained locked in Wewelsburg, the obsession of a regime collapsing around him. Then, in 1945, as Allied forces closed in, the castle was evacuated. Files were burned, artifacts smuggled away, prisoners executed to erase evidence. Matteo was placed on a convoy, destination unknown. Some say he never left Germany, that he perished in the chaos of retreat, buried in rubble, a casualty of fire and steel. But others claim he escaped again. In Allied archives there are whispers of a boy, no older than 10, found wandering among ruins, untouched by the devastation. In Soviet files there are reports of a specimen recovered and transported east, and in American records hidden under the umbrella of Operation Paperclip, there are vague mentions of a living anomaly brought across the Atlantic. None of these accounts agree. All could be disinformation. But one fact remains. After 1945, Matteo vanishes from the public record once more, the eternal child survived the war. But into whose hands did he fall? The world should have ended with the war. The ruins of Berlin, the ashes of Hiroshima, the millions dead, enough to warn mankind of its own madness. And yet war did not end. It only shifted shape. By 1947, the globe was already divided. The United States and the Soviet Union faced each other like predators circling, teeth bared, hands hovering over buttons that could erase entire cities. Each side sought not just weapons but secrets, anything that could tilt the balance of history. It was the perfect environment for a legend like Matteo to resurface. The American Files. In declassified CIA documents from the early 1950s, there are strange, heavily redacted references to an asset of anomalous biological resilience. The wording is clinical, detached, but between the lines, something extraordinary flickers. One memo reads, "Subject displays no significant physical aging across decades of observation. Exposure causes unpredictable temporal distortions in both organic and inorganic matter. Recommend containment under MK Naomi protocols." MK Naomi, the most secret arm of the CIA's already infamous MK Ultra program. While the world remembers MK Ultra for experiments in mind control, drugs, and psychological torture, very little has been revealed about its biological and anomalous branches. If this document is to be believed, Matteo had been brought into the United States, hidden not in a university lab, but in a military vault. There he was not treated as a child, he was an asset. Witnesses, few and mostly anonymous, later spoke of a boy housed in a facility somewhere in the Nevada desert. He was kept in a room with no windows, monitored constantly, his presence recorded by machines that struggled to keep up. Watches stopped in his room, film reels decayed instantly, or in some cases never degraded at all. The CIA's obsession was different from the Nazis. The Reich wanted a weapon of mass destruction. The Americans wanted a key to eternal life. Doctors tried to decode his blood, his cells, his very DNA. In the age before genetic sequencing, their attempts were crude, but the ambition was clear. If the United States could unlock the secret of Mateo's arrested time, they could extend life, create soldiers immune to aging, even preserve leaders indefinitely. But here too, results were catastrophic. Test animals injected with his blood either disintegrated or froze in strange developmental stasis. One report describes a chimpanzee that lived for months without eating or drinking, unmoving, unchanging, until it collapsed into dust in a single night. And all the while, Mateo himself remained the same, a child, a boy with dark hair, eyes that seemed to stare through walls, and that same unsettling smile. The Soviet hunt. But the Soviets had not forgotten either. Captured German records hinted at Project Uigkeit. Soviet intelligence, relentless in its pursuit of Nazi spoils, scoured archives and interrogated surviving scientists. What they found led them to believe that the Americans were hiding something, a living weapon. By 1952, KGB reports described their own attempts to locate the eternal specimen. Some operatives claimed he had been seen in Eastern Europe, smuggled westward through the collapsing Nazi networks. Others insisted he had been transported across the Atlantic, and so began the hunt. Soviet field agents were tasked with locating and, if possible, abducting the child. They scoured refugee camps, hospitals, orphanages. Witness accounts describe men in long coats showing villagers grainy photos of a boy, asking if anyone had seen a child who never grew older. The Soviets, like the Americans, had their own reasons. Stalin himself was obsessed with creating a superhuman army. His scientists had already tried grotesque experiments with radiation, hormones, even interspecies hybridization. To capture a boy who defied time itself would have been the ultimate triumph. A ghost between nations. But Mateo remained elusive. Some say the Americans kept him locked away in the desert until the 1960s, when public scandal around MK forced his existence even deeper underground. Others claim the Soviets eventually succeeded in capturing him during a covert operation in Berlin, spiriting him away to a Siberian research facility. But perhaps the strangest possibility comes from third-party reports, from neither Washington nor Moscow. In 1967, a British intelligence file described a childlike figure seen at a monastery in the Italian Alps. He was accompanied by two unknown men who spoke German. The boy, according to the witness, did not appear to eat, drink, or age. In 1972, a declassified Israeli memo spoke of a rumor that Mossad had encountered a child of impossibility in South America, hidden among the remnants of Nazi exile communities in Argentina. Every nation had a story, every nation had a file, but none could prove they truly held him. And that raises the most terrifying question of all. What if Mateo was never really contained by any of them? What if he was not a prisoner but a passenger, moving between hands, slipping through walls of power, existing on the edge of human history like a shadow no one could hold? The Cold War's silent weapon. Throughout the Cold War, both sides tested bombs that could level cities, rockets that could strike continents, and spies who could change governments. But in the whispers beneath, in the deepest vaults, Mateo remained the secret weapon no one dared reveal. If either side had truly mastered him, extracted his secret, built weapons of time itself, the Cold War would not have been a standoff. It would have been annihilation. Perhaps it was Mateo's greatest act of defiance, not resistance, not violence, but silence. He gave them nothing. He remained, as always, an eternal child, but silence is not absence. And as the Cold War staggered on into the 1980s, new rumors emerged, stranger, darker, and more unsettling than ever. Because if Mateo could not be controlled, perhaps he had chosen to control. The 1980s were years of tension wrapped in spectacle. Beneath the neon glow of consumer culture and the music of a new era, the world teetered on the edge of annihilation. Nuclear arsenals expanded, proxy wars raged, and surveillance grew sharper. But behind the politics, something else stirred. A deeper obsession with the unexplained. For governments drowning in secrecy, anomalies like Mateo were no longer curiosities. They were threats, opportunities, and bargaining chips. Area 51 and the Eternal Passenger. In the deserts of Nevada, behind fences and motion sensors, lay the most infamous military installation on Earth, Area 51. Officially, it was for testing aircraft. Unofficially, it was a vault of secrets. Declassified hints from the 1990s suggest that Area 51 wasn't just about planes like the U-2 or stealth bombers. Files refer cryptically to biological anomalies transported there under majestic protocols, a word tied to the shadowy group MJ-12, long accused of covering up extraterrestrial encounters. And among the rumors of alien bodies and crashed saucers, a different story flickered. In 1983, a former contractor spoke anonymously to a fringe journalist. He described being ordered to install environmental systems in a containment habitat for what he thought was an alien child. The creature, he claimed, looked entirely human, a boy no older than 10, but the staff whispered he had already been alive for centuries. He did not name him, but the description matched Mateo perfectly. Could it be that the Americans had not lost him at all, that they had kept him hidden in the very heart of their most secret base? That they had recast him not as a biological anomaly, but as something even stranger, a passenger mistaken for extraterrestrial. It would explain the contradictions in the records. Perhaps Mateo was not in CIA custody, not in scientific labs, but in the blurred zone where UFOs, Cold War paranoia, and classified research bled together. Soviet psychic wars. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, the Soviets were chasing their own ghosts. In the 1980s, Soviet scientists poured resources into psychotronics, the study of psychic phenomena as potential weapons. They tested telepathy, remote viewing, even biolocation. Their institutes housed children said to bend spoons with their minds, soldiers trained to kill with thought, and experiments that tried to bridge the human brain to machines. Declassified Russian archives reveal one project in particular, Project Rainbow's Edge. According to fragments, Soviet agents believed they had located a child of time somewhere in Eastern Europe in 1985. The child reportedly could not be photographed, his image blurred as if the camera itself decayed. Witnesses described him as playful, humming softly, immune to interrogation. The KGB tried to transport him. The convoy never arrived. Vehicles were found abandoned on a forest road, metal frames rusted as if aged by decades. There was no sign of the boy. The Soviets concluded what the Nazis and the Americans already suspected. Mateo could not be captured, not in any permanent sense. He slipped through hands like sand, but the attempt left behind scars. Documents show that some agents who interacted with the boy returned different. One aged 40 years in a month. Another regressed, his body shrinking to that of a teenager before dying in agony. And one, a woman named Irina Petrovna, vanished altogether. Her family swore they heard her voice in the house at night for years after, though her body never returned. The crossover with UFO lore. By the late 1980s, UFO fever had consumed the West. Reports of abductions, strange lights in the sky, and government cover-ups dominated tabloids and conspiracy circles. Amid this frenzy, Mateo's story became tangled with extraterrestrial myths. Why? Because he no longer seemed simply human. If a boy could exist unchanged for centuries, slip through borders, warp time around him, and defy every attempt at control, was he even human at all? Or was he something older, something outside us, something that merely wore the shape of a child? UFO researchers began circulating a theory that the Greys, the small childlike entities described in abduction cases, were not aliens at all, but echoes of the same phenomenon as Mateo. Timeless beings, neither alive nor dead, slipping in and out of human history. A 1989 paper by a fringe theorist connected dozens of childlike figures in folklore, changelings in Europe, duende in South America, Zashiki Warashi in Japan, all to the eternal child. Mateo was just one face of a global archetype, and if true, it meant he was not alone. Whispers from the labs. Still, whispers from inside secret labs continued. A man who claimed to have worked at Los Alamos in 1987 described a containment breach. A boy, housed for long-term biological study, reportedly vanished in front of cameras. Not escaped, vanished. The guards found his toys, his clothes, even his hairbrush. But the boy was gone, leaving only the faint sound of humming in the intercom system, though no microphones were live. Elsewhere, Soviet scientists described similar anomalies. Rooms where time skipped, clocks reversed, prisoners aged decades in a night, all linked to fleeting encounters with the boy. Mateo was everywhere and nowhere. The 1990s shift. As the Cold War collapsed in 1991, archives cracked open, files poured out, on spies, weapons, failed experiments. But the deepest secrets did not emerge. Instead, Mateo's name disappeared even further. It was as if both superpowers, now fractured, exhausted, had agreed silently on one thing: this child was too dangerous to reveal, even in failure. And yet, reports continued. A schoolteacher in Argentina claimed to meet a boy in 1993 who spoke an ancient tongue. A NATO soldier in Bosnia reported seeing a child who walked untouched through gunfire. And in 1997, during the chaos of Chechnya, a photograph surfaced of a boy, face half blurred, standing among ruins. A boy who looked exactly like Mateo had in 1873. The photograph was seized. The journalist who published it died in a car accident days later. Mateo had survived the Nazis, the CIA, the KGB, and the Cold War itself. But as the world entered the digital age, the question deepened. Would his image, once hidden in classified vaults, now bleed into the internet, where no power could erase it completely? The eternal child was not just a relic of dark history anymore. He was entering our world. And in the shadows of the 1990s, some whispered that Mateo had stopped running, that for the first time in centuries, he was watching us back. The fall of the Iron Curtain didn't silence Mateo's presence. If anything, it allowed his shadow to spread wider, carried not by official archives anymore, but by whispers, rumors, and eventually, the one thing governments could not control forever: the internet. By the mid-1990s, digital bulletin boards and underground forums began exchanging stories too strange for newspapers and too fragmented for academia. Among grainy UFO photos and ghost sightings, threads emerged about a child who appeared unchanged in different wars, different countries, different decades. Some users swore they had family stories going back generations, of a boy with black eyes and a soft humming voice, who arrived in villages during famine or wandered through ruins after bombings, untouched, ageless. In 1996, a Usenet post surfaced in a fringe news group. The user, writing from Argentina, claimed to be the grandson of a priest who had encountered Mateo in Cordoba almost a century earlier. The priest had left behind notes describing him as neither angel nor demon, but proof that our time is not God's time. The post was dismissed as folklore, but it attracted dozens of replies from users in Poland, Germany, and even rural Japan, all insisting they too had heard of the eternal boy in their own traditions. The threads vanished days later, archived only in fragments. Some claimed they were deliberately scrubbed. Others said the moderators panicked because of government pressure. Either way, the myth was now bleeding into a medium no authority could fully erase. Then came the photograph. In 1997, scanned from an old negative and uploaded to an early image-sharing site, it showed rubble in Grozny during the Chechen War. At the edge of the frame stood a boy, slight, pale, no older than 12. His face blurred not by motion, but by something stranger, as if the film itself refused to hold his image. Those who zoomed in claimed his eyes reflected light like glass. Within days, the photo spread. Within weeks, the uploader was gone, their account deleted, their IP traced to a disconnected Russian address. Journalists who tried to confirm the story hit a wall of silence. Still, the image lived on in fragments, reposted, copied, degraded across digital backrooms. For the first time, Mateo was no longer hidden in locked archives. He had stepped onto the world stage. In the early 2000s, as forums evolved into blogs and blogs into conspiracy websites, his legend grew. Entire communities debated him, arguing whether he was a failed Soviet experiment, a biblical relic, or something non-human that had always walked among us. The UFO crowd claimed he was an alien hybrid. The occultists saw him as a time guardian, the same entity described in ancient grimoires, and skeptics dismissed it all as the recycling of folk tales into digital myth. But then came the videos. The first surfaced in 2003. A shaky handheld camcorder clip from rural Argentina showed a boy standing in a field staring at the horizon. The filmer zoomed in. His clothes were old-fashioned, decades out of place. His movements were strange, slow, deliberate, but the wind and grass seemed not to touch him. The video cut out abruptly with static. Analysts later declared it a hoax, but those who enhanced the frames claimed his face was identical to photos from the 1930s and 1950s, unchanged. More clips followed. A boy on a Bosnian street in 1995, captured by a BBC cameraman, though blurred in the officiate footage. A child in Iraq in 2004, caught on a soldier's helmet cam for a few seconds before disappearing around a corner that led nowhere. A boy in Fukushima in 2011 standing barefoot in the floodwaters, humming, untouched by debris. Every time, governments issued statements of denial. Every time the clips were dismissed as editing errors or hoaxes, yet every time witnesses insisted they had seen him. By the 2010s, Mateo had become an online obsession. Reddit threads dissected his appearances, YouTube channels posted breakdowns, and Twitter accounts claimed sightings. Some insisted he followed disaster, appearing where time itself felt fractured. Wars, floods, nuclear accidents. Others believed he wasn't appearing at all, but rather revealing himself because the digital age left him nowhere to hide. And beneath the noise, certain patterns emerged, the humming, always reported, the refusal of cameras to capture him clearly, the stories of those who aged suddenly after contact, or whose clocks malfunctioned in his presence. In 2014, a leaked file appeared briefly on WikiLeaks before disappearing. It described Subject M, a biological anomaly under intermittent observation since 1873. The file claimed the subject had been held at least 4 times by different powers, but each containment failed within days. Notes mentioned temporal disturbances, memory collapses, and localized entropy acceleration, technical words for impossible events. The last line read simply, "Subject continues uncontained. Recommend all pursuit be terminated." Some dismissed it as fabricated. Others swore it was the closest we would ever get to official proof. By now, Mateo was no longer a secret. He was a specter haunting the global subconscious. Not a child, not an alien, not a ghost, but something in between, surfacing where the cracks in history grew widest. And yet, if he was real, if he had survived centuries of pursuit, if he was stepping willingly into our cameras and our networks, the question was no longer who Mateo was. It was why. Why now, in this age of instant recording, of constant surveillance, would the boy who had evaded kings, Nazis, spies, and soldiers choose to reveal himself, unless it was not revelation at all, unless it was preparation, unless the boy had been waiting for us to reach this exact moment in time, when the world itself was too wired, too exposed, too entangled in its own machinery of memory, to finally step forward and show us what he really was. And if that's true, then the sightings are not the story. The real story is what comes next. It began quietly, the way all great disruptions do. A flicker, a glitch, something so small you could dismiss it. In late 2016, live streamers across the world started reporting strange interruptions. Not the usual buffering or lag, but brief intrusions. A frame of static, a warped sound, a child's voice humming under the audio. The interruptions were short, sometimes only half a second, too fleeting for most viewers to even notice. But for those who replayed the streams, who slowed them down frame by frame, something uncanny appeared. A face, not fully, never centered, always on the edge of the screen as if the camera caught it by accident. Pale skin, dark eyes, the shape of a boy's jawline. In one clip, he seemed to be standing in the background of a gamer's webcam feed, though the streamer swore he was alone in his room. In another, his reflection appeared in the lens of a cooking show's stainless steel pot. The sound that accompanied him was always the same, the low, rhythmic humming, almost like a lullaby. At first, the incidents were written off as trolls, but then they started spreading, across countries, across platforms, not just YouTube, but Twitch, Periscope, even CCTV systems hacked into live streams. Security guards would review footage of empty hallways only to hear the hum or see a child pass in a single frame, gone the next. Tech experts tried to explain it as corrupted video packets, but there was no consistent source. The interruptions were decentralized, appearing in completely different networks with no shared servers. Analysts who dug deeper claimed the distortions weren't just random glitches, they carried embedded data. Hidden inside the static were patterns, binary strings repeating in sequences too deliberate to be accidents. When decoded, the strings translated to fragments of text. Most of them were nonsense, but occasionally words appeared, words in different languages, though always the same few phrases. I am here. Time is broken. Don't follow. By 2018, entire forums had dedicated themselves to tracking the phenomenon. They called it the Mateo signal. Users mapped the sightings like epidemiologists charting a virus. The interruptions seemed to cluster around disaster zones, war-torn regions, or places where history itself felt like it was buckling. Syria, Venezuela, Hong Kong. Every time, footage surfaced of the humming boy just before a city plunged into deeper chaos. One chilling case came from Mexico City during the 2017 earthquake. Dozens of live streams went down at the exact moment the quake struck. Hours later, when backup servers restored the corrupted data, the recordings showed the same thing. A child standing calmly in the middle of shaking rooms, untouched by falling debris. His lips were moving, though no sound came out. Only the endless hum overlaying the destruction. People began to wonder, was Mateo warning us, or was he causing these fractures? Governments predictably denied everything. But in 2019, a leaked internal memo from the European Telecommunications Standards Institute circulated briefly before vanishing. It referred to the interruptions as non-linear temporal entities, classifying them as a cybersecurity threat. The memo concluded with a chilling note: containment impossible, adaptation recommended. If that was true, then Mateo was no longer just a myth. He was being watched, catalogued, studied, but not stopped. Then came the live broadcast. March 11th, 2020. A major European news channel covering the early outbreak of the pandemic. Midway through a report, the feed flickered. For 7 full seconds, the image changed. Viewers saw a dimly lit room, stone walls, and in the center, a boy seated cross-legged on the floor. He looked directly into the camera. His eyes were wide, unblinking. His lips moved, but the audio carried only the hum. Then, static, and the regular broadcast resumed. The station called it a technical error, but the clip had already been recorded by thousands of viewers. Analysts slowed it down, enhanced it, and confirmed what terrified everyone. Mateo had looked straight at us, as though he knew the audience was there. From that moment, the sightings escalated. Mateo was no longer slipping accidentally into frames, he was choosing to appear. Entire TikTok feeds glitched into brief shots of him. Instagram live streams froze, showing his silhouette in the dark. Podcasts picked up fragments of his hum, even when recordings had been done offline. And then came the message. December 2021, a live streamer in South Korea was performing to a small audience when her stream abruptly froze. Instead of her face, the viewers saw Mateo, staring into the lens. This time his lips moved clearly, and a voice, distorted but unmistakable, came through the speakers. "You are almost out of time." The stream ended. Her account was delete. Minutes later, the archived video remained only in pieces, scattered across Telegram groups and conspiracy channels. Suddenly, the legend was no longer something governments could dismiss or skeptics could laugh off. Mateo was here, in our networks, in our devices, in the bloodstream of the digital age. Not just seen in war zones or ruins, but in bedrooms, living rooms, kitchens. Anywhere a camera existed, he could step through. The humming was no longer a background anomaly. People began reporting it in their dreams, in the ringing of their ears, in the white noise of their televisions when broadcasts ended. Some claimed prolonged exposure aged them rapidly. Others claimed they forgot days, even weeks after hearing it. By 2022, a frightening theory emerged. Mateo was no longer simply a boy who never aged. He had become something else entirely. Not flesh, not ghost, but a presence woven into the very infrastructure of modern timekeeping, into electricity, into data, into the invisible lattice that governs our world. If true, then he was no longer hiding. He was preparing. And if he told us we were running out of time, the question that haunted every corner of the internet was simple. Time for what? The message, "You are almost out of time," didn't vanish with the live stream. It spread like a plague. Within hours, screenshots, distorted clips, and user testimonies were plastered across the internet. At first, people treated it like another viral glitch, a meme to be mocked or dissected. But the more it circulated, the more its weight grew. For every skeptic, there was someone else who swore they had heard the same words whispered in the hum long before the broadcast. Entire threads on Reddit filled with users recounting how their recordings, their phones, even their baby monitors had carried fragments of the boy's warning. Governments moved quickly. The South Korean live streamer who had captured the clearest footage was never heard from again. Her friends claimed she disappeared that same night. Officials insisted she had gone abroad. The accounts that shared her video began dropping offline, deleted in waves. But the internet is a hydra. Cut off one head and two more grow back. The message spread faster the harder it was scrubbed. And through the chaos, a question clawed its way into the public imagination. What did Mateo mean by time running out? Different groups answered differently. The doomsday cult saw prophecy fulfilled. Some dug up old biblical verses about the eternal child, or watcher of the final hours, twisting them into proof that Mateo was a harbinger of apocalypse. In Texas, a fringe sect built a bunker, convinced the boy was warning of nuclear fire. In Japan, a group began nightly rituals, humming in unison to align with the frequency of the child outside time. Scientists, at least the few who dared to speak openly, offered unsettling theories. A physicist in Geneva suggested Mateo wasn't warning us of war or plague, but of something deeper, a collapse of time itself. If entropy is accelerating, he said in a hushed interview later leaked online, then the boy may not be a curse. He may be the only one who and perceive the fracture before it tears everything apart. His lab was shut down within the year, and then there were the digital prophets, hackers, darknet explorers, and rogue coders who began tracking the anomalies not as paranormal events, but as data structures. They noticed that every appearance, every frame of static, every hum embedded in live streams, followed a pattern. Layered beneath the noise was something far more terrifying, a map. Not of space, but of time. A lattice of dates, cross-referenced against major catastrophes, stretching backward and forward across centuries. The forward dates, though, were blank, until one began to repeat. March 23, 2025. Nobody knew what it meant. Some believed it marked the end. Others thought it signaled Mateo's return in full, not in fragments, but in flesh. Forums began to buzz with speculation. Mainstream media ignored it. Governments denied it. But the hum grew louder. Reports poured in of ordinary people experiencing glitches in reality. Clocks skipping forward minutes, even hours. Phones ringing with no caller, only the lullaby hum. Airplanes losing several seconds mid-flight. Families waking up to discover days missing from their calendars. At first, these were scattered incidents. By 2023, they were global. Mateo was no longer confined to sightings. He was bleeding into the fabric of daily life. The most chilling event came from the LHC in Switzerland. During an experiment, a power fluctuation forced an emergency shutdown. When technicians reviewed the failure logs, they found frames of unauthorized video embedded in the data stream. For 3 seconds, the collider's monitors displayed the face of a boy. His lips formed silent words. "Do not open the circle." Days later, a whistleblower claimed the collider had briefly recorded particles moving backward in time. He disappeared before he could testify further. By 2024, the world was divided. Was Mateo a savior or a threat? Was he trying to stop us from tearing open some irreversible wound in reality? Or was he the wound itself? The sightings became impossible to ignore. A boy walking calmly through the smoke of burning forests in Brazil, a child staring from the edge of the Gaza ruins, a figure watching silently from the crowd during protests in Paris, captured by dozens of cameras though no one there remembered seeing him. Each time, the hum followed. Each time, clocks in the vicinity malfunctioned. And yet, through all the horror, there was a sense of pattern, of design. The boy was not appearing randomly. He was guiding attention, almost as if Matteo was pointing humanity towards something coming, or warning us to look away before it arrived. By December 2024, the humming was everywhere. It wasn't just in footage or hacked feeds anymore. People reported hearing it in the silence between radio stations, in the static of wireless routers, in the pauses of phone calls. Some even swore it came from within themselves, a resonance vibrating through bone and blood. Psychologists called it mass hysteria. But when hospital equipment in multiple countries began recording hum frequencies during patient comas, the denial grew harder to sustain. Now the date is almost here, March 23, 2025. Governments refuse to acknowledge it. Scientists whisper in shadows. The internet is AFL, game with speculation, fear, prophecy. And through it all, Matteo continues to appear, humming, watching, waiting. The boy who survived centuries, who slipped through wars and laboratories, who now inhabits our machines, has left us one final riddle. If we are almost out of time, what awaits us when the clock finally strikes zero? March 2025 crept forward like a shadow, silent yet suffocating. Even those who claimed they didn't believe in the Matteo phenomenon admitted they felt it. The weight in the air, the static in the silence, the sense that something unseen was circling closer with every passing day. News anchors laughed at the online hysteria, but their voices trembled on air. Teachers tried to keep classrooms calm, but children complained of hearing the humming boy outside their windows at night. Flights were grounded across Asia after 3 separate planes reported losing entire hours mid-air, their clocks resetting as though reality itself had stuttered. By March 10th, the sightings became daily. No longer fleeting glitches or hidden reflections. Matteo appeared openly, unmistakably, in broad daylight. A crowd in Buenos Aires watched as a boy no taller than 12 walked straight through a busy intersection, cars swerving as if they hadn't seen him at all. In Berlin, commuters claimed he rode the subway, seated silently while the train lights flickered. Security footage later showed the passengers sitting in those seats were not alone. Matteo was there, blurred but undeniable, humming softly as the train hurtled through the dark. Governments had no answers. Some declared states of emergency, others denied everything while quietly scrambling behind closed doors. But whispers escaped. Task forces were forming, black budget operations activated. A phrase began to circulate in leaked documents, temporal breach contingency. If Matteo was real, then what was comatose? Ing was not paranormal, it was structural. March 15th. The Vatican released an unusual statement, not through press conferences but through an obscure midnight radio broadcast. The voice of an elderly cardinal declared, "The boy has been here since the beginning. He is neither angel nor demon. He is the echo of our mistakes." The transmission cut off mid-sentence. Hours later, the broadcast tower was reported destroyed in a fire. And yet the hum grew stronger. It became inescapable, woven into the infrastructure of existence. Traffic lights flickered in sync with it. Hospital monitors pulsed in rhythm. Even human heartbeats in rare documented cases matched the same eerie tempo. The world was no longer just haunted by Matteo. It was synchronizing with him. March 18th. For the first time, Matteo spoke publicly, not through fragmented hacks or corrupted feeds, but directly, in a live broadcast hijacked simultaneously across dozens of channels. The world watched in collective paralysis as every television, every smartphone, every public screen dissolved into static, and then cleared to reveal him. A boy seated in a dark, windowless room, staring straight into the lens, his lips parted. "The fracture is open." The words were distorted, layered as though spoken in 100 overlapping voices. Viewers reported feeling their ears vibrate, their teeth ache, their vision blur. Some fainted instantly. Others swore they saw the room behind Matteo stretching, warping, bending as though the walls were breathing. "You cannot stop it," he continued, eyes wide and unblinking. "You cannot contain it. You made it. You broke it. Now it swallows you." The feed ended abruptly. Across the globe, clocks desynchronized. Some leapt forward minutes, others froze entirely. Satellite systems flickered, stock markets halted mid-trade as timestamps collapsed. For the first time in recorded history, time, the very structure binding a human civilization, was visibly fracturing. By March 20th, the panic was unstoppable. Cities emptied, supermarkets became battle zones, planes were abandoned on runways. Nuclear bases sealed their bunkers, families huddled in their homes listening to the hum that now poured through radios, televisions, even unplugged speakers. It was everywhere, an omnipresent lullaby signaling the approach of something no one could define. And then came the testimonies. People reported dreams of Matteo not as a boy but as thousands of boys, scattered through every era of history, watching silently. Soldiers in trenches claimed to have seen him on the battlefield. Astronauts whispered he had appeared in the reflection of shuttle windows. Archaeologists uncovered ancient cave paintings depicting a child with hollow eyes standing among stars. The conclusion was terrifying. Matteo was not bound to one moment. He was a fracture given shape, the embodiment of a broken timeline, manifesting wherever the seams of history tore widest. He had always been here. March 22nd, the final calm before the storm. Cities held their breath. Millions gathered online in desperate solidarity, live streaming as the hours ticked toward midnight. Forums filled with speculation. Would the world end? Would Matteo appear? Or would time itself unravel into chaos? In New York, the humming overtook the subway system, lights flickering in sequence with each tone. In Tokyo, entire skyscrapers briefly vanished from view, only to reappear seconds later. In Nairobi, clocks spun backward for an hour. Everywhere, people whispered the same thing: "He's almost here." And then, as the sun set on March 23rd, every device, every broadcast, every flicker of electricity carried the same image. Matteo, no longer blurred, no longer fleeting. A boy of 12, pale, solemn, his dark eyes bottomless. He leaned forward, filling the frame. The hum stopped. For the first time in years, there was silence. "It is time," he whispered. The feed cut. The world held its breath. And then, everything changed. The moment after his whisper, reality seemed to pause. No alarms, no explosions, no fire raining from the sky. Just silence, thick and crushing, as if the entire world had been vacuum sealed. Birds froze mid-flight. Waves on the shore stilled. Conversations died on lips. It was not metaphorical. It was literal. For nearly 30 full seconds the earth stopped, and then the rupture began. Clocks melted into contradiction. Digital displays flickered through impossible sequences. 3:02 became 7:44, then 12:01, then blank. Analog hands spun wildly, some clockwise, some counter, others snapping like broken bones. People screamed as their shadows detached, stretching seconds ahead or behind them like spectral doubles. In Los Angeles, entire blocks blinked out, reappearing 10 minutes later with no memory of their absence. In Moscow, CCTV captured a train colliding with itself, the same locomotive arriving twice, both versions occupying the same track until they shattered apart like glass. In Cairo, a man aged 40 years in a single breath, his skin collapsing into parchment, his body turning to dust. The hum returned, louder than ever. But now it was not just in the air. It was in the bones, in the bloodstream, rattling teeth, vibrating skulls. Hospitals overflowed with patients clutching their heads, eyes rolled back, seizing to the rhythm of the boy's eternal lullaby. Matteo was everywhere, not a glimpse in a reflection or a distortion on film. He was manifesting fully, in every city, every street, every home. Children pointed and said, "There he is," while adults wept at the sight. He stood at the ends of hospital beds, in the aisles of supermarkets, on rooftops and highways. Always the same boy, pale, dark-eyed, humming, always watching. Theories erupted in real time, desperate and hysterical. Some said the fracture had already swallowed us. that we were living the final loop before collapse. Others believed Matteo was multiplying, infinite versions of him bleeding from every wound in the timeline. The most terrifying theory came from physicists who managed one final broadcast before their lab in Geneva disintegrated. He is not appearing everywhere. We are falling into him. The world is folding into the boy. And still, March 23rd pressed forward. At 10:15 p.m. UTC, satellites recorded Earth's orbit faltering. For a fraction of a second, the planet stuttered in space, enough to send tidal waves surging against coastlines. Millions fled inland, but there was nowhere safe. Reports surfaced of people falling through time. A woman in London who stepped out of her flat and into the streets of 1910. A soldier in Gaza vanishing mid-step, reappearing in 2072, screaming of burning skies before dissolving into ash. In New York, Times Square became a theater of terror. Thousands gathered to watch the countdown on the great digital clock, hoping for answers. But the numbers jittered, reset, looped backward and forward. At midnight, the screens turned black. Matteo appeared on every billboard, every phone, every lens. He stood barefoot in a field of impossible light. His voice boomed, no longer a whisper, but a command. You broke the circle. The ground shook. Buildings warped as though made of liquid. Glass melted, but did not drip. It froze in flowing shapes. Gravity faltered, pulling people sideways, upward, inward, toward invisible points. Now you will see it. The sky cracked. Not thunder, not lightning. It split like shattered porcelain, revealing behind it something vast and blinding. A storm of colorless light, bending in directions human eyes could not follow. Some called it an angel, some called it the abyss. All who saw it screamed. Matteo raised his hand. The hum swelled into a roar, a frequency so deep it vibrated molecules apart. Bridges fell, oceans roared, sea time folded in spasms. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was no malice in his face, only sorrow. A boy condemned to deliver catastrophe he did not cause, a child burdened with the collapse of all things. People began to vanish, not in death, but in erasure. Their names, their histories, their entire existence peeled away as though they had never lived. Family photos warped, leaving blank spaces where loved ones had been. Books lost entire chapters. Languages stuttered into gibberish. At 11:59:59, the world buckled. Matteo's voice, layered and infinite, filled every ear, every machine, every fragment of being. This is the last hour. The fracture does not end. It loops forever. And then the clock struck midnight. Time shattered. The earth fell into itself. Darkness. Silence. And then the hum returned, soft, almost tender. Somewhere in the void, the boy's figure glowed faintly. He looked at us, not with cruelty, but with pity, and whispered, "We begin again." The survivors never knew how long the darkness lasted. Some said seconds, others swore it was centuries. All agreed on one thing. When light finally returned, it was not the same world. The sun rose too quickly, darting up from the horizon like a reel played on fast forward. Shadows bent in opposite directions, stretching both east and west. Rivers ran uphill, forests whispered with voices, entire trees humming in the familiar low tone of Matteo. Cities still stood but distorted. Glass towers leaning at impossible angles, streets looping back on themselves like endless Mobius strips. Those who survived were scattered across these fractured landscapes, but none recognized the others. Families had been torn apart, rewritten, recombined. A mother would wake to find her child older than she was. A husband would reach for his wife, only to find a stranger's face in her place. History had been shredded, reality restitched with the precision of chaos. And through it all, Matteo was there. Not one boy now, but countless. They walked in silence along highways of broken time, played in schoolyards that flickered between centuries, sat at dinner tables in homes where the walls shifted like breathing skin. Each Matteo was identical, pale, solemn, humming, but some carried shadows of what lay behind the fracture. Their eyes glowed faintly with stars. Others flickered in and out, existing only in half frames, their bodies never fully solid. People tried to build new lives in the ruins. Camps rose where landmarks once stood, tents pitched in the warped skeleton of the Eiffel Tower, communities huddled inside the frozen husk of Times Square, where the billboards now replayed, fragments of every timeline at once. Leaders attempted to organize, but laws meant nothing here. Time itself laughed at order. You could plant seeds and watch them sprout, bloom and wither in a single night, or remain dormant for decades while your body refused to age. The fracture was not ending, it was permanent. Some called it the loop. Others named it the forever hour. Scientists, what few remained, recorded the cycles. Days replayed, but never identically. Minutes stuttered and stretched. Entire lives lived and erased in the blink of an eye. And yet, there was one constant. Matteo, always watching, always humming, always there when the seams of this shattered reality widened. Some feared him, others worshipped him, entire cults rising from the ashes to call him the Time Shepherd, the child of the end, the boy who carries the circle. Pilgrims marched across warped landscapes, seeking him out, begging for release, for explanation, for mercy. But Matteo never answered. He only hummed. Whispers spread of those who listened too closely. The hum was not a sound, they said, but a map, a language written in frequencies, telling a story of how the world broke. A few swore they could understand it, that Matteo was not the destroyer, but the messenger. That humanity had torn reality itself apart through its endless hunger, experiments with time, with machines that bent causality, with arrogance that thought the universe a toy. Matteo was not born. Matteo was made. A fracture given flesh. The end was not his doing. The end was ours. Years, or what could be called years, passed in the loop. People changed. Some adapted, living fluidly in the shifting flow of reality, unmoored from clocks or calendars. Others went mad, unable to bear the constant folding and rewinding of their existence. Children were born who remembered futures that had not yet happened. Elders died, only to wake again in younger bodies. And still the boy endured, never older, never gone, the eternal witness. At last, one moment came, if moment even meant anything now, when the hum stopped. For the first time since the collapse, silence spread. It was deafening, heavier than thunder. Survivors fell to their knees. Then Matteo spoke, not on screens, not in dreams, but aloud, everywhere at once. His voice was not a boy's anymore, but layered with every version of himself across every fold of the loop. You will never escape this. A pause. But you will learn why. The ground trembled, the skies peeled open, revealing once again the storm of light beyond the fracture. But this time, it did not tear through the world. It hung there, waiting, pulsing. A door or a wound. Matteo lifted his hand, and then he pointed. No one knows who he chose. Perhaps it was you. Perhaps it was me. Perhaps it was someone long erased, stitched back into this broken quilt of time. But when he pointed, the chosen fell forward into the light, screaming not in fear, but in recognition. And the loop continued, always continuing, because that is the truth Matteo carried from the beginning. There is no end, no escape, no salvation, only the endless hum, only the boy, only the fracture. Forever.